It's really a pleasure really to have this session. My name is Jeff Thies, and I am a clinical assistant professor and director of the Institute for Business Ethics and Sustainability. And for both Patrick and Rebecca, Patrick, I'll introduce you in a second, but we have a number of students from a number of classes. One of the classes is Business Ethics and Sustainability. We have finance students, we have accounting students, as well as finance and accounting professors attending this as well. And we're really, really excited to have this opportunity, both to have this time with Financial Times and the resource that you bring and are to our university and to our business education, and also specifically to have this opportunity with Patrick Temple West. Patrick is going to speak to us about ESG investing and his experience and both in the role of media and the series and initiative called Moral Money that is offered through Financial Times. A journalist with Financial Times. Prior to that, Patrick has been a journalist with Politico, with Reuters, and has worked both in Washington, D.C. and in numerous locations internationally. He has a master's from Northwestern, and relevant to us, he's got his bachelor's degree from St. Joseph in Philadelphia, which is part of the Jesuit network. And so we are LA's version of your alma mater. So we're very excited about that as well, Patrick. And one just brief announcement and then a little bit of an instruction. One of the programs that we have is something called CBA Advantage, which is a kind of an engagement tool and mechanism that we're launching this year, where we integrate programs like this with a portfolio that students build of presentations that they've been to and different activities they've involved in. So they basically, over the course of their business career at LMU, create a portfolio that they can bring to their resume and to their job search moving forward. One of the ways that gets recognized is there's a QR code that you guys are invited to scan. It'll be on the screen. It'll be held up at the end of the presentation. So when Patrick and I spoke about this, we really thought it would be best that the design for today really be conversational. And so Patrick is going to share about 20 minutes of a basic kind of orientation to ESG investing and what he sees in terms of trends and dynamics, both in that type of investment as well as reporting in that space. And then I'll ask a couple of questions and really want this to be the opportunity for you guys as students to have the opportunity to ask questions. So without further ado, Patrick, if I can pass it over to you. And again, so wonderful to welcome you.
Great, thanks a lot, Jeff, and thanks everybody. And yeah, feel free to post some questions. I've got the Zoom group chat open here, so feel free to put in any questions. Like I said, as Jeff said, I do want this to be interactive and really to help you get as much from this as you can in asking me questions. If you are looking at getting a job in this field afterward, anything I can do to help you with those conversations and things that might come up in interviews, I'm happy to talk about that if I can offer any advice on that. Yeah, so I joined the Financial Times last year when they started this Moral Money product, and it's a newsletter that goes out on Wednesday mornings and Friday mornings, and we try to recap and do original reporting about new things in sustainable investing, ESG, everything from climate change to sustainable food products like Beyond Meat, Impossible Burgers. And the FT, I think, wisely saw this trend really emerging and catching fire last year, being on the forefront of putting this newsletter and taking a look at sustainable investing, ESG investing comprehensively and thoroughly in a way that some of our competitors were not. Last year, this week, it's UN General Assembly meetings here again in New York. Usually the streets are packed with all the diplomats and leaders coming in, and last year it was a climate gathering. I mean, Greta Thunberg was here holding a rally in Battery Park, and all the leaders who were coming, most of the leaders who were coming in were talking about climate change and the pledges they were making. And you had a lot of the banks in town here, trying to run events and talk about the things that they're doing in developing green finance, sustainable investing products. So the FT was, I think, seeing that trend coming and recognizing that there's an opportunity to delve in and cover the space more. One of the things that we think about when we're looking at what is ESG, we see it really as three buckets of people. You have folks like the environmentalists, religious organizations, socially responsible investors, who are really the tip of the spear, who want to be using their assets to do good with the world. They are pushing companies to change on environmental policies, social, human rights issues. Everything kind of comes down to human rights concerns for them, and they will file shareholder proposals to agitate for change at companies, try and get the board to wake up and recognize that this is a risk that they face and should address. Then you have the second bucket is companies that see this space as a business advantage. How can you get an edge on your competitors? How can you use sustainability to instill customer loyalty? I mean, a couple of the businesses that we throw around a lot, they're publicly traded, Starbucks, IBES, it's come to mind as some of those brands that really try to at least portray themselves as being sustainable and socially conscious, and using that to get an edge on their competitors. The third group of people we think about is companies that don't care at all about sustainability, don't care at all about ESG. They just want to do what their competitors are doing. And if their competitors are thinking about this and are talking about this, what do they need to be thinking about and working to move forward on ESG to make sure that they're not falling behind? Because they can, as we've seen over the last few months, the assets under management into ESG funds is really growing at an almost exponential rate. And this means that if you are not being ranked highly against your peers on ESG rankings, you're not being bought up by these ESG funds, and that is just potential buyers that are leaving your shares on the table. So it does have share price considerations, consequences if you are not taking ESG seriously. So these are the companies that are talking to their consultants about what should we be doing? How do we make sure that we're in the middle of the pack? We don't want to be spending too much money on this. We don't want to be as far out in front on these issues as Starbucks and Levi's. We want to just make sure that we're holding competitive and staying the course. So those are some of the things that are driving this attention to ESG. The banks have jumped all over the space, both on equities and fixed income. On the fixed income space, we've seen them issuing a lot of green bonds for companies. This debt is often oversubscribed, often comes from very well, highly rated, credit rated companies like Apple to begin with. So they can get really good borrowing costs on this, but the banks are doing more green bonds and getting more creative with sort of sustainability linked bonds that they feel like they can get buyers for. And yeah, again, on the buy side, there's just more and more attention and interest in this that those products are finding a home. So those are all the components to this ESG and sustainability space that we've been covering. And it's really, I've seen it, and like Jeff said, I came from Washington before and was covering financial regulations broadly and corporate governance issues broadly. And I'd pitch stories. I'd want to write about various shareholder proposals at Apple or somebody. And the editors would say, why are we writing about this? This stuff is non-binding. Nobody pays attention to this. Even if it does get a good vote, it's not binding on management to do anything. And now everybody's writing about these shareholder proposals. They're getting a lot more attention. And you talk to some of the law firms that are working for companies and how to manage their corporate governance profile, how to deal with these shareholder proposals when they come up. And you hear them say like, yeah, this is really a board level issue now, that they have to take these things seriously. So it's getting a lot more attention in the media. The NGO, the activist community is taking this more seriously. I think a lot of this energy behind it from the environmentalist community stems from the current administration, which has sidelined environmental protection. So people are looking at ways to, what can they do with their money to influence change through corporate behavior. And that has been a big story for us, and we are continuing to follow the developments on this. Again, it's Climate Week, our UN General Assembly Week here in New York, where many more pledges are being made. And the other aspect of what we're looking for in the media is greenwashing. Where are examples of companies that are issuing green bonds for various tanker ships to transport oil around the world? Well, they're issuing a green bond to put a solar panel on top of that tanker. Is that really worthy of a green bond designation? And there is increasing battles among regulators and standard setters about what it should mean to be a green bond. Can you be an oil company and issue some sort of green debt and make the case that, well, we're issuing this because we need to invest in cleaner renewable energies. We want to get on a better path. We're a heavily fossil fuel emitting company now, but we want to get there. Does that warrant give you ability to issue a green bond? So that's some of the things that the industry is wrestling with now. And that's pretty much our coverage. So anything I missed there, Jeff? Anything you'd like me to...
Maybe just a couple of questions. You referenced the regulators and the standard setters, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what you see related to the standard setters, because there seems to be a lot of concern about the lack of uniformity in measurement about this, so that you have a ESG company that also then becomes an ESG stock, and that's part of an ESG index, and they're rated, but how are they rated, and what are the dynamics in the rating, and what do you see there from a current and kind of a moving forward standpoint?
Because this sector has grown so much in such a quick period of time, people really haven't ironed out the definition issues and what it means to be ESG. And you're starting to see, like in baseball, you have the National League and American League, and you're starting to see with ESG and sustainable investing, different paths emerge. They're still playing the same game, but they're playing it by slightly different rules. So we do have, and something that we hear from companies a lot is they're having to deal with various standard setters, whether it's the Task Force for Climate Change Disclosure, which was started by Michael Bloomberg and Mark Carney in the UK, pushing companies to disclose, well, what are their climate risks? And the attempt there is to really get companies to focus on how might they be affected by wildfires, by droughts, by extreme weather, in ways that they aren't recognizing now. They want companies to take their climate risk profiles as seriously as they would interest rate risk or competitor risk. You have other efforts like SASB, which is doing something similar to that and trying to localize what reporting should look like from sector to sector. So if you have telecoms disclosing one way, well, telecom don't need to disclose the same things that an apparel company might need to disclose. So they are working out standards for each different sector, and that process is going along. But you do have these different reporting mechanisms. It's not always easy to find where these disclosures are being made. A lot of that, going to the regulator perspective, has to do with SEC requirements for this, which are still emerging and still not as strong as maybe they are in Europe and the UK. We're seeing Europe lead a lot more in this space. And again, the US, based on the administration we have now, isn't taking these disclosure requirements as seriously. So we have something similar to a GDPR situation where Europe is taking the lead and companies are deciding to apply what they need to do in Europe globally. So that's a bit of the lay of the land on the standard setters and the regulators.
And one of the articles that I was looking at distinguished, they called it innovation companies that basically launch new industries, and that being one kind of player in the ESG space. And then the the organizations or companies that transition, older industries or mature industries that transition. And I wonder what you see there, and is that kind of is that a dynamic that you see in the ESG space, and kind of just general observations about that distinction?
One of the things that I've seen, and I did a story about this actually on California and its low carbon fuel standard, as really driving behavior among old school oil and gas companies. It is getting more and more expensive for them to emit carbon now, as the credit that California mandates gets more and more expensive. So if you are a fossil fuel producer, you have to buy these credits in the open market. If you are a renewable energy company, you can sell credits into the market. And because the credit price has gotten so high, these renewable energy companies are making a lot of money, and it's making it more economically feasible to do things like take the leftover kitchen waste, fats and oils, and turn that into a renewable fuel that can be loaded onto planes at LAX. Oil companies are now recognizing that they need to have a plan for this, because the price of oil is so low and that it's costing them so much to get this credit. So they are now transitioning. Example of old school businesses recognizing the market need for sustainability to come around and to make those changes that hopefully is better for the environment. That's just one example that I could, and happens to be one I can think of in California, but other states are doing that. Oregon has its own program. It's a little bit newer. I think New York might be thinking about its own low carbon fuel standard, but that's one example of the old school companies finding new life in a more sustainable fashion. Then you have startups like, we frequently use the example of Beyond Meat as a sustainability story. One of the issues with the Brazilian forest fires last year was farmers were burning down the forests to provide more grazing land for their cattle. Well, if people are eating Impossible Burgers, Beyond Burgers, that's just less beef that needs to be produced and less forests that need to be cut down. I'm sure there are sustainable and ESG issues with Beyond Meat, but it seems like that has become a bit of a sustainability story, and as an example of really hot product that revolutionized the beef industry. How many Wendy's, Burger King, they all offer Impossible Beyond Meat burgers now, and you didn't see that just 2 or 3 years ago.
I guess one final question, then let's open it up. But you spoke about the kind of the marketplace pressures related to ESG companies and investing, whether it's the Black Rocks and the Vanguards, et cetera, not wanting to lose out and really position themselves in this space. And then you spoke about the regulatory environment in both positive and negative regulatory climates, and Europe being different than the United States, California having a different approach than the federal, et cetera. And then you mentioned risk and factoring risk mitigation and that being a driver. And I wonder how you see those in relationship to one another. Is one of them driving most of this, or are these converging, or just kind of how do you see the interplay?
They're converging. I mean, and I should have mentioned this more in the conversation about what is ESG investing, because you had groups like the religious organizations, the environmentalists, who really saw ESG as an avenue to drive change at companies. Now you're seeing investment banks, asset managers seeing ESG as a risk mitigation tool. How can you use an ESG screen to pick better, smarter companies? It's like Moneyball almost. If you're looking at the same game, but through a different lens to analyze companies, players in the case of Moneyball, companies in the case of ESG investing. It's just a different lens through which you can evaluate risk. And that's how a lot of the companies that don't want to be seen as activists, as particularly the moral companies, I mean, they kind of want to stay away from all that because of various politics in both the US and abroad. They just want to do whatever their business model is and do that. They are rationalizing it more and more about, well, how do we incorporate ESG into that as a risk mitigation tool? And again, going back to the task force for climate change disclosures, that's how they've framed what they want reported is this is just a risk mitigation effort. If you are a company that is disclosing more information about where you are vulnerable to droughts, floods, extreme weather, you are giving more information to shareholders and they can make more informed decisions about that. And the shareholders have, up until this point, been rewarding companies for doing that. So that's where the risk idea comes into ESG, and the companies, the businesses that don't want to be seen as particularly left or right are embracing ESG through the risk avenue.
Thank you. So why don't we, thank you so much, Patrick, really appreciate that. And let's open this up. If you could use the hand raising function on, the reactions tab on Zoom, and let me just call on those who would like to ask a question or, kind of move the conversation forward.
We have Morgan Brooks who's raised her hand.
Hi, thank you so much for speaking to us. I know you talked a little bit about how the administration hasn't really been supporting ESG as of late, so there's been more private investing among people. Do you think that this momentum in the ESG field will continue after the election?
We do, and regardless of who wins, it's something that we've been thinking a lot about going into November. I do think that this energy and enthusiasm for ESG and the money flowing into the sector from all the well-known banks will continue because companies have made these pledges and companies recognize that there is a brand loyalty component to this. They don't want to backtrack and be seen as lagging their peers and competitors. And this is getting so much more attention in the media that they have to follow through on promises. Otherwise, they'll be called out for greenwashing and not doing that. So you can put a pessimistic spin on this too, but I think from folks that we've heard from in the industry, that's how they are framing this. They say if President Trump gets reelected, it's unlikely that this ESG and sustainability conversation will come to a dead stop and that banks won't be investing in this and they won't be issuing more green bonds because this has a big demand out there for these products. If Joe Biden wins the presidency, you potentially could see more regulation on the ESG, especially on the climate change front. I mean, some of the Democrats that I've talked to about this, they say, mandating some sort of climate change disclosures would be a big first priority for Biden SEC and Treasury Department. One of the concerns is, as we're seeing play out with Ruth Bader Ginsburg's successor, is what the courts will think of that. There is a concern that any regulations, regardless of its financial disclosures or other regulations that a potential Biden administration would want to put into place, that could be struck down by the courts, and that happened a lot under the Obama administration, but it could get worse under a potential Biden administration. So we are potentially seeing a lot of these same conversations on ESG and sustainability continue regardless of who's in the White House. And I just like issues like the fires in California aren't going to go away depending on who's in the White House. So there is going to be a need for companies to be responding to these issues and to be putting a promise out there to customers and their shareholders that they are aware of it and responding to it.
Thank you.
John, you have your hand up?
Yep. Hey, thanks for coming and speaking to us. You talked briefly about how like different states take this kind of investing in kind of climate regulations, environmental regulations differently. I was just interested what state has the best kind of system for encouraging those sustainable companies to grow and flourish.
Yours
And
by far.
yeah.
I'm sorry, I shouldn't have assumed you were sitting in California, but it's California.
And is there anything that California, if it has, since we have the best system, what could we do more to change it and improve it? And are there certain flaws with the current system, even though maybe it's like the best in the country?
I mean, again, what California does often applies to other parts of the country, because if you're a big company and you have to operate in California, why not apply those regulations nationwide, globally? In fact, I think California is doing a lot and can just continue doing what it's doing. But on like emissions standpoint, California is just one part of the conversation. It's minuscule compared to the emissions from India and China. So you see this a lot with some of the smaller European countries as well. They're way ahead on renewable energy, in prioritizing women on boards, on good corporate governance regulations, but they're just one piece of the pie. And yes, California's the sixth, seventh largest economy, but it's still dwarfed by China and India. I guess just anything more that California could do. The pension funds, CalPERS, CalSTRS do a lot on pushing companies to take these issues seriously. I guess just step up more so there and really encourage other states to get involved and to follow their lead. Maybe working more closely with some of the other progressive leaning states and their pension funds to kind of pool resources to, when they are going to companies that agitate for change, have more of a united front. Because a lot of the times it is California and New York pension systems that are going to battle with these various companies to push them on climate change or human rights. If there were other states and sort of the more of the purple states, companies would have to take those concerns even more seriously.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Carolyn has her hand up.
Hi. So I know we've been talking a lot about regulations and how that is bringing us to develop more sustainably. And I noticed this morning in the news, Gavin Newsom had put out the executive order to have zero emission vehicles by 2035, I think. Do you think that that sort of goal would be achieved through other means other than regulation? Or do you think that businesses, when there's such an infrastructure required to achieve that goal, like charging stations and whatnot, and consumers have to make that decision on themselves, do you think it's possible to achieve those kind of goals without regulation, or do you think we have to really push for regulation?
It's a great question and great point. I actually have to write about this Gavin Newsom executive order for tomorrow, so I have to do some homework after this to figure out what all he did. But regulation can always push companies, always be the push to get companies to do more of and in a more standardized way than they already were doing. What was California previously had that emissions rule for autos that battled with the Trump administration over, and then you had like Ford on one side and a Toyota on the other side or something like that. It's those type of regulations that can always push companies to do something. And companies drag their feet and they can fight it in court, but regulations are really important to kind of getting everybody on the same page. On this electric vehicle question, there was always the challenge of putting charging stations. What did you need first? Did you need the charging stations first? Or did you need the electric vehicles first, so that there was a market for the charging stations? I think a lot of that has been resolved, but announcements like these can really force companies to do it and create a business incentive for companies to do it. If you were a charging station, if you were working in this space before, and now suddenly there's a government mandating this, wow, you've got a buyer, you've got demand out there. This is great for you. So it can really foster that kind of development. I think that, yeah, the regulations are really important and good. It's just a lot of, I mean, there are, the other thing is that there are market forces that are doing this already. Obviously, Tesla is a great example of building a car company that's become wildly successful on renewable electric vehicles. But that can only go so far. And I think it is the government regulations that can push everybody in that direction. So while market forces help, sometimes it's the power of the government to standardize things.
A quick piggyback on that, if I could. So the way the mayor of Los Angeles, Eric Garcetti, presents it, and it's part of LA's Green New Deal, their sustainability plan, et cetera, is to not just look at the regulatory side, but talk about government as the purchaser in building consumer markets by building collaborations with other cities and essentially having government procurement be one of the marketplace drivers as well.
Okay.
I wonder how you see that, and do you see that more in Europe than you do in the United States?
Yes, I was just going to mention that. Yeah.
Okay.
That is how Europe, which has its own green version of a Green Deal, is thinking a lot about. And Europe is just doing so much on the green and sustainability front. It's hard for us to keep track. But one of the things that they're doing is they will prioritize looking for green sustainable investments when they are building out infrastructure or something, so that is a way of prioritizing it. And that's, yeah, to your point, it's not government regulation. It's not seen as so heavy-handed, but it is a way that the government can encourage that growth. But again, that has to be set at the top. And obviously, Mayor Garcetti was a pioneer on a lot of these issues. So it has to, you have to have that leadership, and you have that in Europe to really want to do that.
Lindsay?
Hi, thank you so much, first of all, for coming in to talk to us today. Really appreciate it. So this is kind of a two-part question, and looking at the different industries that are growing right now that are looking at being environmentally sustainable, which one do you think is the fastest growing? And then which industry do you think is present but is not growing fast enough to meet climate change and all of the needs that we're seeing in terms of the environment?
In the first question, it really is the electric vehicle space. That is just so much demand. All the major car companies, and I really don't cover auto, so I can't quite answer that as technically, as specifically as you'd like, but they are jumping into this space so quickly. I mean, GM invested $2 billion in Nikola, this electric truck manufacturer, and they didn't even have a truck built yet. So there's just so much money flowing into the electric vehicle space. Elon Musk had his big batteries day the other day. There's a lot of money going in there, and you're just seeing so much in the electric vehicle space that I think those will be a majority of autos driven in this country in the next few years. On your second point about the companies that are present, how did you phrase it? They were the companies that are...
Yeah, sure. So like, are there certain industries that you feel are necessary for making sure that we don't max out on our environmental resources, but you don't feel these industries are like growing fast enough to meet the needs of the earth?
So that'll be the oil and gas sector. They have been obliterated, frankly, by the low oil prices in this OPEC fight. And it's reflective in their share price, which is not recovering anytime soon. I mean, those companies were really in trouble even back in like 2014 when oil prices started to take a plunge, and it's just gone down from there. They recognize that they need to have a plan, a transition plan for renewable energy. You've seen some smart companies, NextEra comes to mind, about transitioning to wind, solar, renewable energies. They're a utility, so not kind of utilities and oil companies are both in the same boat here. But they had prioritized renewable energy decade or more ago, and are kind of a pole position to take advantage of this in the moment. So the oil and gas utility space still has a lot of work to do. And again, it's set by the tone at the top. A lot of the executives there are probably just hoping that, well, this is a lull in oil prices. You know, we'll see this. We've seen tough times before. Things will recover. They may not. And this is, even if they do, they're really putting their heads in the sand sort of about the whole overall environment situation that they're contributing to. So that's the one sector that really needs to transition. They know it, even if they don't say it, but more needs to be done there. I think this current oil collapse caught a lot of them flat-footed, and they're all just now scrambling to put a plan together for how to transition.
Thank you.
And a lot of that goes back to green financing and what I was saying at the top about how to build out renewable space. If you are an oil and gas company and that's all you know how to do, how do you transition to wind, solar, hydro? You have to issue a lot of debt to put in the R&D and capital spending to make that happen. Can an oil and gas company issue a green sustainable bond that PIMCO or asset managers that are looking for this debt, will they buy it, or will they be afraid to buy it because they'll get accused of greenwashing?
Kiki?
Hi. Thank you for coming, first of all. And what would you advise us as students to keep an eye on the stock market regarding companies that are really working on innovation and sustainability?
So first thought, MSCI, which is a index provider, makes public its rankings of companies' ESG scores. So you can just go online. They made this totally free of how companies are ranked on ESG. And so you can go in sector by sector. You can find obscure companies way down in the Russell 1000, how they score. So you can see that, and which companies that are not Microsoft, Apple, Amazon, how are they prioritizing this space. Morningstar is another ratings agency that is providing some of this data. You can get some of it online. Bloomberg, if you have access to terminals, they have great resources on ESG disclosures from companies. You can find a lot of information about how companies are, what they're disclosing, how seriously they're taking this, how they are ranking against their peers on ESG scores through Bloomberg terminals that has a lot of information on it. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Lucas?
Hi, thank you for coming, first of all. And I just had a question that kind of touched on something that you already kind of talked about, but I was wondering if you have like a little more insights. I was just wondering, like, what's the future of oil companies, and like especially like if you have any idea of like what it will become for, like, in California, you know, Chevron, for example, is
right
in California. What are they going to become after 2035, let's say, because of that new order?
Yeah, they are in dire straits right now. And you've seen this in their layoffs and the write-downs that they've had to do quarter after quarter. I don't cover oil and gas specifically, so I'm not the best person to be able to answer that question, but just my initial thoughts are some of these oil companies are trying to bolster their plastics production. The New York Times actually had a really good story about this, about how oil companies are trying to push plastics development in Africa to keep their oil efforts, their petroleum efforts going. So they're looking at that space, and the coronavirus COVID crisis has done a lot for that, just because companies are less likely to say, oh, we're going plastics free. There were, even this time last year, a lot of countries were talking about eliminating single-use plastics. Well, that's kind of gone off the radar because of coronavirus. people are prioritizing sanitation right now. The other thing on oil and gas, I mean, while electric vehicles are doing phenomenally well and there's just so much money pouring into that space, people still are driving trucks and flying planes and cars. So there is still going to be a consistent demand for it. They're just not going to be able to spend money to invest in new oil and gas reserves and drilling because the price is so low. So I think the oil companies will limp through for a while, but if they haven't already developed a renewable energy plan, they're really in danger. And then you have so many of the like companies that we don't even think about, upstream, midstream, downstream oil and gas providers that are really reeling from this now. A lot of them are either going to go out of business or merge with competitors. The sector is just going to get smaller. Hopefully that is a plus for the environment, but the demand for a lot of the oil products is still going to be there. So it remains to be seen what really the state of the sector will be, but it's not going to rebound anytime soon. At least that's what we're thinking.
Thank you.
Patrick, I wonder, you mentioned at the beginning, at your introduction, really the recognition that many of the listeners will be in the job market soon,
Yes.
and kind of how you see opportunities and how to position oneself related to these themes in terms of job search?
Yeah. If you want to kind of two paths, if you want to go work for a company not in finance, there are a lot of corporate social responsibility jobs that are open. Just having any insight into what's going on with TCFD, SASB, what companies are thinking about in terms of issuing green bonds, sustainability bonds. Those are the things that companies and their boards are dealing with real time, how companies have to resolve disputes with shareholders on human rights, climate change concerns, and thinking about how a company should message that. I mean, does it make sense for a company to go the approach that Starbucks and Levi's do, where they're just all in on this and really the first penguins in the water when it comes to trying to move the corporate landscape forward? Does it make sense for a company to do that? It might not. If you're not a consumer-facing company, maybe you don't need to have as strong a CRS department and reporting regime as you might want. So maybe it makes sense to save money on that front. Are you a company that's looking to go public? What should you be thinking about? How do you tell your ESG sustainability story as a company? It's thinking about it that way that you might get asked about in interviews, because all the boards and executives that we're talking to are wrestling with these questions. So just looking at the company and doing a little bit of research on what its ESG rankings might be would help in interviews. On the finance side, if you're looking to go work for asset managers, brokerages, banks, they are developing these green and sustainable products. And it's knowing what those products are, reading a little bit about how they work, and when it makes sense to issue them versus go the more conventional, traditional route. The banks, brokerages, asset managers are very nervous about being portrayed as greenwashing. They have to deal with a lot of environmental activists who question their green credentials. So thinking about when does it make sense to go ahead with green products for a client versus when to hold back and maybe try something else. That's what the banks and asset managers are wrestling with. And they really are they have to have an ESG sustainability story themselves, because that's part of their reputation going forward. And also about, and we've seen this conversation come up a lot for finance about whether to do business with oil and gas, fossil fuel, producing companies at all. If you are a mid-sized European bank that domestically does not have much of an oil and gas market, you can make the claim, yeah, we've totally cut ties with all our oil and gas, utility, fossil fuel clients. We just don't do business with them anymore. If you're a US bank, you really can't say that because you're bound to touch oil and gas utilities somewhere along the way. But it's something to think about, and something that, again, the banks are wrestling with is, can they make the decision to cut ties with those clients to win the day on the green front, or do you try a different messaging that maybe is not as ambitious in terms of sustainability? So can I ask you a quick question? Who else is looking to get jobs or thinking about jobs in the sustainability ESG sector? Any thoughts about what you want to do specifically, or anything that, any questions for me about what maybe you're looking for or areas you're going into?
Anyone want to go into media? Journalism?
Brianna raised her hand, I think, if I saw that. Morgan, Lindsay.
Fortunately, it wasn't for journalism though, sorry. I'm a marketing major, but I would really like event services and stuff like that. Obviously with the coronavirus, that's kind of put a hold on events and hospitality quite a bit, but I do really enjoy a lot of the classes I've taken on ethics and sustainability and corporate social responsibility and integrating that into a business. And so I have been starting to think about how I could do that in my field, even though it's not necessarily under ethics or sustainability.
I mean, were you thinking about like in the hotel sector specifically, or?
A little bit. I have, obviously right now I do like regular event stuff, kind of labor organization setup, working with places to do that. But I was thinking more of the hotel types, or working in big businesses to do their events and services.
Yeah. I mean, on just one quick thought on that, going back to like the plastics conversation, a lot of the conferences that are going to, and again, this is if you're in with like the sustainability crowd, this is all they think about. But they were going plastics free. I mean, all the utensils, all the paper was just paper, and you almost had to have that if you were doing sustainability, ESG minded conferences. They were already going in that direction, thinking about just for the breaks, for the lunch breaks and all was going in that way. You can think about carbon offsets for when people are flying again and they're coming in from abroad or from a different city. Does it make sense to, for the conference, to devote some funds to pay for people's carbon offsets, or ask if they'd be willing to, as part of their conference fee, pay for a carbon offset? Carbon offsets are getting a little bit more controversial. People are starting to say, well, you know, that's kind of buying your way out of it. But still, that was, I mean, just two thoughts on the event space. That was something that I was seeing last year.
Patrick, Gaetan, please.
Yeah, I had a question. So we talked about this in class. I work in the restaurant business, and because of COVID, obviously, we've been noticing a lot of the usage of plastic and paper, and we talked about it as being an ethical dilemma. Where does the decision-making process start, and how do you come to a decision where obviously the safety of the people is more important? Right. And how do you say, for example, we can pollute as long as the people are safe? Like, where does that come in, and what kind of decision-making does it intend?
I mean, I think it's one of the sad consequences of this whole coronavirus crisis is it really pushed onto the back burner a lot of the sustainable products that restaurants and beverage companies were doing. I mean, I had a great conversation with folks who got the Super Bowl to go with aluminum cups this year. So you got a memento and you're getting an aluminum cup as opposed to a plastic cup for beverages. And they were looking to roll that out at stadiums across the country, and more stadiums were going in that direction. So yeah, I think that the sanitation has to come first. But I do know that companies in the plastic space are using the coronavirus and the sanitation concerns to eliminate single-use plastic bans. So I think it was in New York, California, maybe, they delayed their single-use plastic bans. Was it Rebecca, New York? Yeah. And, you know, in the name of sanitation, and the plastics companies were hoping to get those bans eliminated permanently. So I think a lot of it is just, let's see what's going on with the coronavirus for right now. Let's just take everybody's health and sanitation into consideration, and let's just keep moving forward on eliminating single-use plastics when people are more comfortable with the state of play. I think that's just the smarter way to handle the ethics of that, is to lean toward sanitation, but make customers comfortable knowing that, well, we're going to go back to recyclable materials when it's wise to do so.
Thank you.
Ms. Caleb?
Hi. I want to go into investment banking, and I really liked what you touched on when you were talking about companies' risk exposure to certain climate crisis and say the hurricanes in the East Coast or fires out here, and taking that into consideration while doing valuations on companies.
Yes.
It's going to be like exponentially important going forward. I don't know if you have anything more to touch on that.
It's every sector. I mean, one of the disclosures I saw was Six Flags. So they put in there it was new this year, their vulnerability to extreme heat, which when you think about it, you don't want to be going to an amusement park when it's 120 degrees outside. And they never put a disclosure like that in there before. So we think a lot about flooding risk, fire risk, but there's so many sectors now that are being exposed to extreme weather events that people had not been thinking, even the companies themselves had not been thinking about before. So if you're going into that sector, anything more you can think about risks to companies, whatever sector, if you get into research or something, how that industry might be exposed. It's just part of the conversation that every investment bank is now starting to look at climate and where their vulnerabilities to that might be before it's too late. And for a lot of sectors, it's already too late. But more that you could think about on that, more to prep for that, thinking about what are the sources of data, where are creative places to go for data on climate resources or risk analysis. There's so many of these consulting firms that just do climate analysis forecasting for banks, hedge funds, asset managers that didn't exist before, and their business was doing really well. So just thinking about those type of risks, it's something we haven't quite got into yet, but some of the social risks that have now blindsided companies this year. What does your workforce look like? Are you vulnerable to shareholder resolutions? Is that going to be something that you have to think about? Is there a risk that your office in Europe might have to disclose more on its workforce profile, maybe than in the US or something like that? So there are increasing social risks that people are waking up to as well. And just, again, looking at company valuation through this lens can help pick winners and losers.
Thank you so very much, Patrick. Just a kind of a little word from the sponsor. Last year, the Institute for Business and Sustainability hosted a day on LA real estate and understanding that in terms of the climate challenges. And just one, and this is all on our website, but one example, the city of Long Beach contracted with AECOM, which is a multi-billion-dollar engineering development firm, and they work to build a climate assessment, risk assessment for the city of Long Beach. And they're looking both at flooding in their coastal areas and extreme heat just within the city. And so it's really a both and. And for the students, you can see all of the videos of those presentations and really a discussion about how both business and the community are grappling with these things and working with companies really to get the data. In fact, it's interesting, the AECOM representative, who's one of their directors of sustainability, said, you know, we just got new data yesterday, so I'm updating the presentation I'm giving to you as this is real time informing our consulting practice. So just as an example of what you're describing.
Jeff, do you mind if I just chime in for 1 second, if that's
Please.
okay?
Sure, of course, Rebecca, thank you.
Sure. So I'm part of the Financial Times too. I'm not the editorial team. I work on the education team and I educate faculty and students about the Financial Times. So I kind of did my best to listen to everything, and I'll try to send Jeff and Josh some links afterwards. So in case students want to start reading Patrick's columns, the Moral Money newsletter in general, which is really, really excellent, very well read in financial services. So if you're planning on going there, know that they are reading it too, and they're going to be really like amazed that you read it too. So go be awesome. And then the other thing I just wanted to mention is we will also be launching a climate hub. Patrick might know the date more than I will, but in the next, I want to say in the next few weeks.
Yeah, probably October.
So I'll be sure to send that over to you. And we're also launching an education hub, which will have a section for students and careers, and I'll be sure to pass all of that along. And I'm so pleased we were able to coordinate this, and I'm glad that I was able to listen in, so thank you.
Rebecca, thank you so very much, and thank you for everything, both Patrick and Rebecca, and then Financial Times and what you offer. I would also share with the students, with this opportunity, I have the Financial Times app on my phone, and then the links to the Moral Money newsletter, et cetera. So it's really accessible, and just really want to highlight that. And then just finally to say that we want to thank you, frankly, for the topic of moral money, to understand the ethical dimension really of our financial practices, investment practices, these kinds of things. Money isn't in one world and ethics in another, but the real question is, how do we articulate and express our values financially in the full spectrum of what you've shared is really embodied in the very title of your initiative. And so thank you so very much for that. So just, we're going to wrap up here. Patty, if you could hold up the QR code, please. There it is. And thank you, Patrick and Rebecca, for your patience with this process. We really appreciate it. It's been an absolute honor for us to have this presentation. Thank you so very much.